Good morning, everyone. So today's lecture, it's the second part of respiration. In an earlier lecture, I had talked about physiology of respiration, where we had discussed about the structure of the lungs and about the breathing mechanism like inspiration, inhalation, and expiration or exhalation. And we had seen that what are the different modes of breathing and how breathing or respiration can be regulated by the help of neurons and also through chemicals. Now, today's lecture is the second part to that, and in today's lecture about respiration, we are going to talk about the exchange and transport of gases and regulation. Now, objectives of today's lecture, they are the mechanism of respiration. Then we will have the Bohr effect. Then we will talk about the Halden effect. Then we will talk about intrapleural breathing and respiratory gas transport. So these are the major objectives of today's lecture on the transport and exchange of gases during the process of respiration. So here we have a look at the mechanism of respiration. So we see that the mechanism of respiration, what all does it involve? It involves the breathing mechanism and the exchange of gases. Now, the gaseous exchange, it occurs by diffusion. As we saw that there are walls involved and there are small capillaries in the walls of the alveoli through which the diffusion of gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide takes place. So, the gaseous exchange, it occurs by diffusion through the alveoli. And what does it depend upon? It depends upon the pressure difference between the blood and tissues, the atmospheric air and the blood, and the exchange of gases. It takes place at the surface of the alveolus. Okay. Now, in the alveolus, there is a wall, and the wall, it is porous. So it is made up of small holes or capillaries through which the gases like oxygen and carbon dioxide can diffuse, or the gases, they can be efficiently exchanged between the two. So the gaseous exchange during the respiration, it takes place through the surface of the alveoli, which is the end of the bronchioles. And what happens is when the blood, it reaches the lungs from the heart and finally it goes to the alveoli, what happens is through the small pores or capillaries in the alveolar wall, the carbon dioxide is taken up and oxygen is given back to the blood. So the blood gets oxygenated and travels out of the lungs back into the heart. Now let's have a look at how the exchange of gases prominently takes place during the process of respiration. Now the exchange of gases, they take place in the following manner. First, let's talk about the transport of oxygen. Oxygen in the blood is carried to the tissue in two forms. What are the two different forms? They are the oxyhemoglobin, chemical composition of oxygen with hemoglobin, and solution of oxygen in blood plasma. The oxygen in the blood combines with hemoglobin when the concentration of oxygen is high in the blood. So the oxyhemoglobin is a complex which is formed by the combination of oxygen with hemoglobin. And what is hemoglobin? Hemoglobin, as we saw, is the protein part of the RBC molecule. It is made up of 4 strands of protein with the Hem molecule in the center. It is the iron containing molecule in the center. So hemoglobin has the capacity of carrying 4 oxygen molecules. So oxygen combines with hemoglobin to form oxyhemoglobin. And the oxygen in the blood, it combines with hemoglobin when the concentration of the oxygen is high in the blood. Oxyhemoglobin, however, thus formed is highly unstable and it dissociates to release this oxygen. Low oxygen, low pH and high temperature stimulate the dissociation process. So what happens is, this is how oxygen is transported, that hemoglobin is present in the RBC which occupies or which forms the 99% of the cellular composition of the blood. And RBCs, they have the tendency to combine with the hemoglobin. It contains the hemoglobin. Now, hemoglobin, it has the tendency to combine with oxygen, resulting in the formation of oxyhemoglobin. Now, oxyhemoglobin, it is the oxygen carrier of the blood. So, oxyhemoglobin carries the oxygen through different organs of the body, and for oxyhemoglobin to form, the concentration of oxygen in the blood has to be very high. But the problem is oxyhemoglobin is unstable in nature, and that is why in the presence of low oxygen, low pH and high temperature, oxyhemoglobin, it undergoes dissociation. Now, what is this internal respiration? The gaseous exchange taking place inside the tissues is called the internal respiration. Here, the oxygen carried in the form of oxyhemoglobin gets dissociated to release oxygen. This oxygen breaks down the glucose to release carbon dioxide, water, and energy. And the energy is utilized by the body while the carbon dioxide is diffused from the tissues. So, as we said in the beginning of the respiration lecture, that there is a certain difference between breathing and respiration. And we saw that breathing is primarily what? Breathing is primarily a biochemical process, whereas, sorry, breathing is primarily a physical process, whereas respiration is a biochemical process. And this is what we are seeing, that respiration, at the end of the process of respiration, energy is released. The gaseous exchange taking place in the tissues is called the internal respiration. The oxygen carried in the form of oxyhemoglobin, it gets dissociated to release the oxygen molecule. Oxygen, it breaks down the glucose and releases the carbon dioxide, water, and energy. So you can see that oxyhemoglobin, being unstable, breaks down to oxygen, and the oxygen, it breaks down the glucose to give out energy. So at the end of the process of respiration, certain amount of energy is always released. Now, what is the Bohr effect in respiration? Now, there are two important effects that we are going to see during the process of this respiration, and that is the Bohr effect and the Halden effect. Now, what is Bohr effect? Now, carboxyhemoglobin dissociate and they form the hemoglobin. And so first we see that it is the carboxyhemoglobin, that is the combination of carbon dioxide with hemoglobin. It breaks down, giving rise to hemoglobin and carbon dioxide. Now, this hemoglobin, which is formed by the breaking down of carboxyhemoglobin, it reacts with oxygen to give you the oxyhemoglobin. Now, transport of carbon dioxide from tissues to lungs. Now, obviously, carbon dioxide which is released has to be transported from the tissues to the lungs. And how is it done? The carbon dioxide is transported by three mechanisms. Number one, some carbon dioxide dissolves with the water of the plasma to form carbonic acid. Now, this is one way. Carbonic acid, it ionizes to form the bicarbonate ions. The hydrogen ions are catalyzed by the enzyme carbonic anhydrase. Bicarbonate ions combine with sodium and potassium to form bicarbonate and potassium bicarbonate. Okay, so what we see here is that some carbon dioxide dissolves with the water of the plasma to form the carbonic acid. Then carbonic acid, it ionizes to form the bicarbonate ions, and the hydrogen ions are catalyzed by the enzyme which is called carbonic anhydrase. Bicarbonate ions combine with sodium and potassium to form sodium bicarbonate and potassium bicarbonate. Some carbon dioxide combines with hemoglobin to form carbaminohemoglobin. It is finally carried to the lungs and released out of the body through the process of expiration or exhalation. So carboxyhemoglobin and carbaminohemoglobin, they might sound similar, but they are two very different things. So carbon dioxide, when combines with hemoglobin, it forms carbaminohemoglobin. Sometimes it is called carboxyhemoglobin, but it is not the same. And then it is given out in the form of exhalation. Okay. So carbon dioxide transported by three mechanisms: through the formation of carbonic acid, through the formation of carbaminohemoglobin, and the carbonic acid, it ionizes to form the bicarbonate ions. The hydrogen ions, they are catalyzed by the enzyme carbonic anhydrase. Bicarbonate ions combine with sodium and potassium to form sodium bicarbonate and potassium bicarbonate. Now, after the Bohr effect, where we saw that the carboxyhemoglobin breaks down to give you hemoglobin and carbon dioxide, now comes the Halden effect. Now, what is Halden effect? Now, Halden effect is nothing but it is just a continuation of the Bohr effect. In Bohr effect, what did we see? In Bohr effect, we saw that uh, the carboxyhemoglobin, it breaks down to give rise to carbon dioxide and hemoglobin, and this hemoglobin molecule then reacts with oxygen to give you the oxyhemoglobin. This oxyhemoglobin is carried by the red blood cell throughout the different organs of the body to produce or to provide oxygen to the organs, and this is known as the Halden effect. Okay, so oxyhemoglobin, once it is formed, it will again dissociate, and carbon dioxide combined with hemoglobin to form carboxyhemoglobin. So this Bohr effect and Halden effect, they work hand in hand. So on one hand we have the Halden effect, and on the other hand we have the Bohr effect, and they are interrelated with each other. They might sound different, but they are more or less the same. Now, next we have is something which is known as intrapleural breathing. Now, as I said, that lungs are like spongy air-filled sacs which are present inside a bag which is called pleura. And inside, in between this pleural membrane and the lungs, there is a fluid which is known as the intrapleural fluid. And some certain amount of breathing takes place there, which is called the intrapleural breathing. Now, intrapleural breathing is used to refer to the pressure that is present in the space between the pleura and the lungs. This space is known as the pleural cavity because that is the space in between the lungs and the outer bag of the sac, and it's called the uh, pleural cavity. Now, the pressure in this region, it is normally less than the atmospheric pressure, and that is the reason why pleural pressure is termed as the negative pressure, because it is less than the outer atmospheric pressure, and that is why it is termed as the it is a negative pressure. Now, the lung movement is governed by the pressure gradient, which is called the transpulmonary pressure. It exists between the pleura and the lungs. The difference in the pressure between the intrapulmonary and intrapleural pressure is known as the transpulmonary pressure. So, because of a pressure difference, this kind of breathing takes place, and the pressure inside the pleural cavity is less and it is negative in nature. The pressure in the pleural cavity while breathing turns negative, while there is an increase in the transpulmonary pressure causing the lungs to expand. So there are two different types of we can say two different types of pressures which are interplaying. One type of pressure is the intrapleural pressure, and the other type of pressure is the intrapulmonary pressure. Now, both these pressures are acting one upon the other, and we can say that the pressure in the pleural cavity, while breathing turns negative, there is an increase in the transpulmonary pressure causing the lungs to expand. So, if the pleural pressure decreases, the transpulmonary pressure increases, and vice versa. So, there are two different types of pressure, but they are working, antagonically with each other. While expiration, the lungs recoil as a result of an increase in the pleural pressure. So during the process of inspiration or inhalation, what is happening is the pleural cavity or the pleural pressure is, it is decreasing, but the transpulmonary pressure, it is increasing. But during the process of expiration or exhalation, the lungs, they recoil, and it causes an increase in the pleural pressure. The competing forces inside the thorax results in the forming of the negative intrapleural pressure. One of these forces is associated with the lungs elasticity. So what they're saying is that now these this transpulmonary pressure and we can see that the pleural pressure, they are opposite to each other, and these are the competing forces that we are talking about. Now the competing forces inside the thorax, it results in the formation of a negative pleural pressure. One of these forces associated with the lung elasticity. The lungs have elastic tissues which cause it to be pulled inward of the thoracic wall. An inward pull of the lung tissue is also generated by the surface of the alveolar fluid. The inward tension generated from the lungs is opposed by forces from the thoracic wall and the pleural membrane. So what we see is that apart from the normal inspiration, inhalation, expiration or exhalation, we also have kind of intrapleural breathing or transpulmonary pressure. Now, what is this intrapleural breathing? Now, as we say that there is a pleural membrane or a pleural cavity, that is the space in between the pleural membrane and the lungs, and the pleural pressure is actually less than the outside pressure. We say that's a negative pressure. So in intrapleural breathing, there are two opposing types of pressure. One is the transpulmonary pressure and the other is the pleural pressure. So during the process of inhalation or inspiration, the pleural pressure it decreases and the transpulmonary pressure it increases, whereas during expiration, the pleural pressure it increases and the transpulmonary pressure it decreases. So, and antigonically, these two they compete with each other, giving rise to the intrapleural breathing. Oh, sorry. Now, next we have is the respiratory gas transport. Now, what do we mean by the respiratory gas transport during the process of respiration? Now, after the gases have scattered in the lungs, causing the blood to become oxygenated, leaving carbon dioxide, the next phase of oxygen-rich blood transport to the tissues take place. Okay, so what they're saying is that after the gases, they have scattered in the lungs, causing the blood to become oxygenated. So that is what is happening, right? The arteries were carrying out the blood from the heart to the lungs. And lungs, they contain a mesh of capillaries where the oxygenation process is taking place, and the oxygenated blood it comes out of the lungs and it is carried by the veins back to the heart. So the gases they have scattered in the lungs, causing the blood to become oxygenated, leaving carbon dioxide. The next phase of oxygen rich blood is transported to the tissue, and that is the process that takes place. Meanwhile, the next round of deoxygenated blood needs to be brought to the lungs for the cycle to continue. Okay, so that is another, you can say that obviously another round of deoxygenated blood is needed to be brought to the lungs, and then the cycle again continues. So from deoxygenation to oxygenation takes place, and the oxygenated blood is again transported to the tissues. In the bloodstream, the transportation of gases occur all through the body, which is contributed to cardiovascular system comprising of the blood vessels and the heart. The blood carrying oxygen leaves the lungs to flow into the heart through the pulmonary veins, which are pumped to the rest of the body from the left ventricle through the aorta and its corresponding branches. So here in this respiratory gas transport phase, we see that how the lungs and the heart, they're interrelated with each other. The arteries carrying the deoxygenated blood moves out of the heart and comes to the lungs containing a lot of capillaries. That is where the oxygenation takes place, and the oxygenated blood leaves the lungs through the veins, reaches the heart, and the heart pumps the oxygenated blood to the different organs of the body through the left ventricle through the aorta. And that is how, you know, this entire oxygenation deoxygenation cycle and circulation process is complete. So these are some of the practice questions that I have jotted down after the lecture. So I'm sure that once everyone has gone through the lecture, they'll be able to answer these basic questions. So the questions involved in this lecture, they are the mechanism of respiration, discuss the Bohr effect of respiration, discuss the Halden effect of respiration, and explain the transport of gases in respiration and what is intrapleural breathing. Okay. So these are the important questions that are inserted in these lecture. So I hope that at the end of the lecture of respiration, I am able to explain the physiology of respiration, that what is the structure of the lungs, what is the function of each of these structure essential to the lungs, how is respiration different from breathing, and what happens during inspiration or inhalation, and what happens during expiration or exhalation, And then we have, in this particular part, we have talked about the exchange of gases, as to how in the Halden effect, the carboxyhemoglobin, it splits to give you hemoglobin and carbon dioxide. And then hemoglobin combines with oxygen to form oxyhemoglobin, which is circulated through the length and breadth of the body. And in the Bohr effect, this oxyhemoglobin breaks down to give you hemoglobin and oxygen, and carbon dioxide combine to form the carboxyhemoglobin or carbaminohemoglobin. And exchange of gases takes place at the surface of the alveoli in the lungs, because it is porous in nature. There are small holes or capillaries through which the exchange of gases significantly takes place. So in the alveoli, what happens is that the carbon dioxide is absorbed and the oxygen is returned back to the blood. The blood becomes rich in oxygen and it leaves the lungs. Okay, so that is the basics of the exchange or the transport of gases, that the deoxygenated blood, or the blood which is rich in carbon dioxide, it leaves the heart through the arteries. Through the arteries, it is brought to the lungs, where in the alveolus the exchange of gases takes place. The deoxygenated blood is absorbed and oxygenated blood is returned back to the blood tissues, and this oxygenated blood is carried back from the lungs through the veins into the heart, and the heart pumps this oxygenated blood to the different organs of their body through the ventricles and aorta. And that completes the blood circulation system, or as we can say, the respiration system. Now, this is where I have taken the reference for my lecture. And I hope that by the end of this lecture, I'm able to give a clear picture about the physiology of respiration and the exchange and transport of gases. That's all from my side. Thank you very much.